political and theory together and have a better grasp over what we mean by political theory. Consider once again the examples in the first paragraph. Many of us have an opinion on most of these issues. Some of us are interested in seeking an explanation of the actions of the police, the Supreme Court, and the government. Are these any motives behind the actions of these agencies? Do their actions serve the interest of the entire community or the narrow interest of a class or perhaps a tiny political unit? For instance, some might argue that the issue of a Gujarati identity is used to further the interest of rich peasants. Others may claim that identity is a non issue, that the real motive underlying every public action is class interest. The academically minded amongst us may claim that there exist structural reasons underlying these actions. For example, the slow implementation of Rega might be due to systematic institutional biases hidden from the consciousness of power wielders. Is doing political theory the same then as explaining an act, practice, event, or process? This does not appear to be so. Although explaining is part of political theory, surely it is not the whole of it. And this for two different reasons. First, because an explanatory statement does not on its own constitute a theory. If I say that I fell down because I stumbled unknowingly upon a stone, I have offered an explanation of why I fell down, but I have offered a theory of what has happened. Or if I say that the United States has invaded Iraq in order to have easy access to oil, I would have offered some explanation of why the United States government acted the way it did. But is this the same as articulating a theory of it? No. Why so? Second, although explaining may be a part of theorizing, it is not the whole of it. There are other functions of theory. For example, theories offer justifications of actions. Take the examples of the first paragraph again. Some of us might slightly condemn equal rights to women in ancestral property or justify police brutality. Others may disagree. They might denounce police action as violative of the most basic human right or rejoice that equality now covers an important gender issue that had hitherto been neglected. These justificatory statements do not constitute theory, but they may be its crucial components. Moreover, in denouncing police action, we are necessarily evaluating it negatively. All justifications presuppose evaluation. Behind these evaluative judgments are deeper issues. With this, we are at the end of page number 4.
Issues in Political Theory, edited by Katrina McKinnon. Introduction. Chapter contains what is political theory, political theory and the real world. Plan of the book. What is political theory? Political theory is the study of how we should live together in a society. Given that there are many aspects to social life and social cooperation, there are many dimensions to political theory. Broadly, these can be divided into three intersecting categories: interpersonal relations, state-personal relations, and global relations. In relation to interpersonal relations, the key question is how we should divide up the benefits and the burdens of cooperative activity. Who should get the spoils and who should pay the cost? We also need to know when and how we may defend ourselves against one another. What limits should be placed on how people may treat one another, and what penalties can be imposed on members of society who transgress these limits. Further, how should people relate to one another within these limits? May those different from us in beliefs and practices be condemned and shunned? May we prevent them from speaking? And how should those among us who are dependent, the infirm, the ill, the old, and the children be treated? Who is responsible for their care, and what form should that take? Still further, we need to know how we should organize ourselves in smaller groupings of society to which we all belong at some point in our lives. How should families operate? What obligations do employers have to their employees? Should classes and castes be abolished? And how, if at all, do voluntary groupings, religions, pressure groups, trade unions, etc., help us to live together well? In relation to state, personal relations, question address whether and why individuals should accept the political authority of the state, what its limits are, and how those who wield the power of the state should come to do so. Have we all consented to have this power exercised over us? If so, when and how was it given? If we have not consented to it, is the state illegitimate and may we reject its edicts? If we should and do accept the state, what are its limits? May the state monitor our movements, communications and interactions with others without our knowledge? May it require us to serve, militarily or otherwise, in times of war or peace, on pain of punishment? May it set limits on what may be said and on with whom we associate? May it tax us to fund spending of which we disapprove? May it interfere with how our children are raised? And what is the best way in which to choose the group that has its hands on this immense power? Most people in democracies now reject the principle of hereditary rule. But why is democracy preferable? Why not benign dictatorship instead? And what makes a state democratic? Finally, there are a set of questions that are related to the scope of any justified principles of social cooperation and justice. Do such principles apply only within the borders of a given state or nation? Or should they be extended to apply to all states everywhere? Perhaps the principles that govern the relationships between states are supported by different arguments and have different content than those that apply within states. Or perhaps we should get rid of states altogether and opt instead of a world government. If, however, we stop short of that and decide that global relations between states should be governed by some principles of justice, questions that arose in relation to the interpersonal relations must be faced again. What is the responsibility, if any, of the developed to the developing states? How may a state act unilaterally or multilaterally towards any state that threatens it? What are the conditions under which war is just? Was the radical British philosopher John Stuart Mill right in his claim that refusal to fight in a war against any unjust regime is cowardice? These categories are rough and hide a multitude of further complexities and sub-questions. Answers given to questions in one category very often affect answers to questions in another. For example, if we believe that all people are equal in virtue only of their humanity, and that as such each deserves an equal distribution of the benefits and burdens of social cooperation, then we will have to work hard to assert that the mere fact that a person is a citizen of rich country makes him or her more deserving of the benefits that attach to that membership than someone unfortunate in being born in a poor country. Or if how children are raised within families is a matter of legitimate political attention, if, for example, every child has the right to be free from violence and hunger and has the right to education, then significant interference by the state in the private realm of the family may be unavoidable and even required. Finally, there are some themes in political theory that involve thinking about interpersonal, state-personal, and global relations all at once. Questions about how to protect the environment, in particular those relating to climate change, are a good example. Despite these complexities and omissions, the categories and questions just listed give a good indication of the breadth of issues about which political theorists think. Box 0.1 Kant on unsocial sociability. Immanuel Kant, an influential thinker of the Enlightenment, had a distinctive view on the attraction and repulsion that exists naturally between human beings and conditions their social and political lives. Men have an unsocial sociability, that is, their tendency to come together in society, coupled, however, with a continual resistance, which constantly threatens to break the society. This propensity is obviously rooted in human nature. Man has an inclination to live in society, since he feels in this state more like a man that he feels able to develop his natural capacities. But he also has a great tendency to live as an individual, to isolate himself, since he also encounters in himself the unsocial characteristic of wanting to direct everything in accordance with his own idea. This idea was quoted by Kant in 1970, page 44. Box 0.2. J.S. Mill on War. Commenting on the fight against the slave-owning South by North Americans in the Civil War, J.S. Mill said in 1984 on pages 141 and 142 of his book that war is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. The decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling, which thinks nothing worth a war, is worse. A man who has nothing which he is willing to fight for, nothing which he cares more about than he does about his personal safety, is a miserable creature who has no chance of being free, unless made and kept so by the exertions of better men than himself. Political theory and the real world. How do political theorists think about such questions? Very often, a distinction is made between normative and descriptive thinking in order to address this issue. Normative thinking is thinking in terms of how persons, society, or the world ought to be. Descriptive thinking aims to present a picture of how persons, society, and the world actually are. In this way, descriptive thinking can be said to mirror the world, while normative thinking aims to change it. The claim is often made that political theory is a normative subject. Political theorists tell us how people ought to interact, the sorts of laws we ought to pass, what it means for democratic systems to function well, etc. A further claim is then sometimes made that this shows that political theory does not connect with real world and so is of little practical use. While it is true that political theory is normative, however, it would be misleading to claim that it contains no descriptive elements and to use that as basis of saying that all political theorists simply sit in the armchairs and dream up utopias, while the world outside the study door marches on without them. Political theory involves some descriptive thinking in at least two ways. First, many political theorists operate with a set of background assumptions that describe the world to which their theory applies. For example, most thinkers concerned with distributive justice, that is, the way in which goods ought to be distributed among people, assume that circumstances of justice hold true. Box 0.3. Hume on the circumstances of justice, on abundance and justice. For what purpose makes a partition of goods, where everyone already has more than enough? Why give rise to property, where there cannot possibly be any injury? Why call this object mine, when upon the seizing of it by another, I need but stretch out my hand to possess myself of what is equally valuable? Hume 1975, page 184, on extreme scarcity and justice. Suppose a society to fall into such want of all common necessaries that the utmost frugality and industry cannot preserve the greater number from perishing, and the whole from extreme misery, it will readily, I believe, be admitted that the strict laws of justice are suspended in such a pressing emergence and give place to the stronger motives of necessity and self-preservation. Page 186. On altruism and justice. Why raise landmarks between my neighbor's field and mine, when my heart has made no division between our interest, but shares all his joys and sorrows with the same force and vivacity as if originally my own? Page 185. On egoism and justice. When a man sees such a desperate rapaciousness prevail, such a disregard to equity, such contempt of order, such stupid blindness to future consequences as immediately have the most tragical conclusion and must terminate in the destruction to the greater number and in a total dissolution of society to the rest. His particular regard to justice is no longer of use to his own safety or that of others, and he must consult the dictates of self-preservation alone. Page 187. Now the box is over and we continue with the text. The circumstances of justice are conditions that make the measures advocated by the theorist possible to implement. Scottish philosopher David Hume is the source of an account of the circumstance of justice that states 1. That people are mutually disinterested. That is, that they are not interested in each other's interest. 2. That there is a moderate scarcity of goods. The first assumption means that people are neither perfect altruists, in which case they would not need principles of justice because they would give away their goods to anyone in need, nor perfect egoists, in which case they would never be trusted to abide any principles of justice proposed anyway. The second assumption means that there is not an abundance of goods, in which case people would not need measures to divide goods fairly because there would be enough for everybody. Nor is there extreme scarcity, in which case no distribution of goods could be fair because every distribution would mean death for some. Of course, these assumptions are not descriptions in the sense that they mirror how things are in the world everywhere, but neither are they normative. In assuming these things, political theorists are not saying that this is how the world ought to be. It would clearly be better for all if we lived in circumstances of abundance. Rather, these assumptions and many others like them that provide a background for political theorizing describe a world in a state that is the best we can hope for, given what we know of that world and how the creatures in it operate. This takes me to the second way in which the political theorists are concerned with the real world. While these assumptions do not always reflect exactly how the world is, and so are to that extent ideal assumptions, it matters to the political theorist that they are not so removed from the reality that they are nothing but fantasy. It matters that the principles and recommendations advocated on the back of these assumptions are achievable, which means that the assumptions themselves must describe forms of social interaction, personal dispositions, and institutional design that we can imagine being instantiated in the world, given our knowledge of it. Of course, what we know about human beings and the world in which they live is constantly evolving. And to that extent, what counts as achievable will always be changing. For example, it would have been unimaginable to Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, that I, as a woman, could be in a position to be writing this introduction, given that he thought women's souls were inferior to those of men. Nevertheless, theorists do their best. They can in framing these necessary assumptions to make them realistic and to be free them of dogma and prejudice. To help them to do this, they often turn to other disciplines and the insights about people and the world that they contain. For example, law, economics, sociology, history, or psychology. So, in order to get to the point of making normative political recommendations, political theorists engage in descriptive thinking, albeit often by imagining a world that is slightly removed from and slightly better than the one we know. But because political theorists do not only theorize for fun, because they want their theories to make a difference to how we live together, they keep an eye on the realism of the assumptions they use. Political theory is for real, living human beings with all their fragilities, greed, kindness, and cruelty. It is not for angels, aliens, or monsters. A final reflection relates to the much commented on lack of interest in political matters that is often related to low voter turnouts. People, especially young people, are often represented as apathetic and uninformed on key political questions and as full of distrust and scorn for politicians. Whatever the truth of this, and to whatever extent it may be justified, this lack of interest in politicians and party politics is not tantamount to a lack of interest in politics. Politics is a far wider and more interesting subject than the stuff of politicians' spats, and if these people were genuinely to lack an interest in politics, they would lack any interest in life. Obviously, opinions on the war in Iraq, university tuition fees, the UK ban on hunting with dogs, or whether to permit assisted suicide are political issues. But so are perhaps less obvious thoughts of the kind that occur even to people who proclaim themselves totally apolitical. For example, worries about the care available for one's aging parents, the amount of time one has to wait to see a doctor in the UK NHS system, the difficulty of getting onto the housing ladder as a first-time buyer, or the safety of town centres on Friday nights for single women are all in large part political worries, because they relate to aspects of the way in which we live together. Even in a world without political parties, politicians, or even states, that is, even in a world without the complex formal political systems and processes that have evolved in our societies over time, there would still be politics, because we would still have to decide how to live together, even if it were just within our tribe or extended family. As Aristotle famously remarked, man is by nature a political animal. 350 BC, 1987, page 509. And if this is true, then anyone who is truly uninterested in politics is not fully human. Plan of the book. There are many ways in which an introduction to political theory might be framed. Some focus on schools of thoughts, that is, isms, such as liberalism, nationalism, socialism, egalitarianism, etc. Others take a thinker-based approach and tend to be more historical in nature. For example, a chapter on the liberal tradition might start with a look at John Locke and move through time to John Rawls as its most influential recent representative. In this book, however, we focus on concepts and place these in school or associate them with thinkers only as and where appropriate. This gives an accurate picture of the interlocking aspects of political theory and the extent to which its key concept figures in what might at first appear to be distinct and unconnected debates. The topics of the chapter in this book have been chosen to reflect key sites of activity in the discipline of political theory as it stands today, in particular with an eye to the most important, visible, and influential strands in political theory over the last 15 years. The concepts and issues discussed in them have framed and have themselves been informed by the political discourse and practice of the late 20th century and the beginning of the present centuries. The book has also been written specifically bearing in mind the practical nature of political theory, as outlined in the last section, the way in which political theory aims to change the world, while connecting with its realities. To this end, each chapter is accompanied by a detailed case study in which the themes and questions posed at the level of theory in the main chapter are explored and probed at the level of practice. The case studies show how political theory can be put to use in analyzing and critiquing hotly debated aspects of politics in the world today. They should encourage the readers to try out such analysis and critique on topics he or she cares about using the concepts and strategies of arguments to be found in the chapters. Political theory is a dynamic, exciting subject with the potential to change people's minds and thereby change the world. Putting theory into practice in the case studies show many ways in which this might happen. The order in which the chapters are presented reflects progression in the academic debate from more traditional problems in chapters 1 to 4 to concepts and issues that have been somewhat revised in debate to produce often surprisingly radical proposals for political practice in chapter 5 to 11 to newer debates reflecting changes in the real world context in which politics happen and with which political theorists are just beginning to grapple in chapters 12 to 14. Chapters 1 to 4 discuss the perennial problems of political obligation, nationality, war, the nature of democracy. The focus in these chapters is on the state, or state-like bodies and its relation to its members and other states. Chapter 5 to 11 address questions about the different ways in which individuals within a political community can relate to one another. In these chapters, the issues are what individuals owe to one another as a matter of justice or in virtue of other politically salient shared characteristics. The reflections in chapters 1 to 4 on how such community achieves democracy and what is owed to it by its members have clear relevance for the questions of liberty, tolerance, equality, social justice, human rights, multiculturalism, and the citizenship that are addressed in this part of the book. Chapters 12 to 14 move into new territory by exploring concepts and issues that reflect recent changes in the context of politics and concomitant calls for the set of values embedded in political theorizing to be enlarged or even replaced to make such thinking responsive to these changes. The reflections on gender, the global scope of justice, and the challenges posed by the environmental degradation problematize the issues and significance of the values and concepts that will have been encountered in earlier chapters. What is locus of political obligation in a globalizing world? Can democratic decision-making avert looming environmental crisis? Does commitment to toleration or liberty make the oppression of women invisible? And what is the content of citizenship if nation-states recede as the primary political actors on the international stage? The aim of this book is to ensure that the readers gain a firm grasp of the basics of contemporary political theory while being given a sense of its dynamism and its potential to connect with political practice in exciting and surprising ways. Although the chapters progress in the way outlined, the book is not linear and has multiple points of entry. Readers should feel free to dip into the book at any point and then follow up the featured cross-references to chapters with which it is thematically connected for a deeper understanding of associated debates and related issues. The topics and questions of political theory are not freestanding and independent of one another. Themes crisscross and debates in one area can be fruitfully enhanced by those in another. The marginal cross-reference will indicate points for which this is particularly the case. Making arguments in political theory is not a matter of making it up as you go along. There are ways of arguing that are better or worse than others, and arguments may have more or less informed content. This book shows such arguments in actions and reveals the difference that good arguments in political theory might make to the world we know. Familiarity with these methods and the deep understanding of the key concepts of political theory that reading this book will deliver will equip readers with a conceptual toolbox that enables them to address their own arguments to real-world political problems. A side note here, this is where the reading has ended. The plan of the book that has been mentioned here is not the plan of the reading. In fact, it is plan of the book Issues in Political Theory by Katrina McKinnon, and the introduction of this book has been included in a syllabus. Thank you. I hope this reading was clear to you.